We would like to express our sincere gratitude to all illustrious panelists, moderator, and the participants for accepting our invitation and coming together at such a short notice. It is indeed our privilege to welcome such a vibrant collective on our platform to discuss our latest book, The Marginalized Self, published by Primus Books, New Delhi. The discussion will be moderated by Professor Salil Mishra, Vice Chancellor, Ambedkar University, Delhi. Professor Gyan Prakash, Department of History, Princeton University, USA, will be the key speaker for today's program. Professor Rajkumar, Department of English, Delhi University, Mr. Manish Sinha, DG, NICF, Mr. Arvind Mohan, journalist and author, and Dr. Arvind Mishra, one of the co-editor of this book, JNU, have been kind enough to accept our request to be part of this panel. On behalf of Deshkal Society, I extend my warm welcome to all of you, as well as the kind participants who have joined us from India and abroad. Before we treat further, let me apologize to you in advance for any technical issues that rise during the session. We can assure you we do have measures in place to go ahead with the session in spite of such disruptions. First of all, we would like to underline this is a collective project, and that is interdisciplinary in nature, with social psychologists, historians, anthropologists, and development practitioners being part of this project. Since the beginning, Rahul Ghai, Arvind Kumar Mishra, Arun Kumar, Badri Narayan, Rafiul Ahmad, and myself have contributed to the project and subsequently led to the publication of this book. In spite of our collective efforts, it would have been difficult to bring out such a nice book in a public and academic domains without the consistent support and advice extended by the Primus Book under the leadership of B.N. Barmaji. I would like to share briefly about the book. The Marginalized Self questions the century-old perception of the Musar community as rat-eating, pig-rearing, habitually drunk, lazy, and unmotivated, a perception fostered by the dominant discourse of development and the historically prevalent hierarchical social system. This collection of essays argue that these victims of dominant model of development require a different kind of power and critical consciousness due to their marginality, which helps them to examine the processes, practices, and institutions that give rise to and justify poverty, displacement, corruption, greed, competition, and violence in the name of development. Ethnographic studies focus on the Musar have demonstrated that these communities are capable of offering resistance to the might of the development regime in terms of comparative critique of modern civilization. They can assert the value of their own worldview and epistemology, and in doing so, they subvert the superiority that is generally assigned to the logical and formal schema in understanding the world, and which often speak in contradictory, evasive, ambiguous, and metaphorical terms. The book offers insight into marginality, culture, and development in India, and will be the interest of the student, scholar, practitioner, and policymaker associated with the discipline of the development studies, social work, social anthropology, critical social psychology, history, and public policy. In this context, the book is merely an academic, not merely an academic exercise for Deshkal Society particularly, and fellow researcher too. Right from the inception of Deshkal, we believe in practice with knowledge. Since 2000, during the research project, we frequently encounter a myriad of voices and that ask as to what difference this project will make in the daily lives of the Musar community, which subsequently help us reinforce our belief in practice with knowledge. In a sense, it was a logical culmination to pursue sustainable work for sustainable development and dignity of the Musar Bhuiya community in particular, and marginalized community located in the South Bihar, India in general. All these years, Deshkal Society has strived to generate action research, documentary film, audio-video documenting related to culture, resistance, and dignity of the Musar Bhuiya community. Simultaneously, the team of Deshkal Society, with intense engagement of the community, have been strengthening the public institution by ensuring quality education in government schools, delivering homestead land to the landless poor, and securing livelihood support for women in coordination with village-based, community-based organization in primarily the Bodh Gaya region and Bihar in general. The organization practice outcome are entitlement to homestead land for more than 20,000 family, provision of quality education to approximately 40,000 children by ensuring 1,000 teachers in 150 government primary and upper primary schools, and economic empowerment of around 1,000 families from among the most marginalized community of Musar are some of the milestones employing the approach of practice with knowledge. In addition, Deshkal Society has been formulating the key questions and experience emerging from the practices and bringing out publication for informing the policy in academic domains in India and abroad. This book is the best example in this regard. Before inviting Professor Salil Mishra to moderate the session, I would like to briefly introduce him. Professor Mishra is currently Dean at the School of Law, Governance and Citizenship, as well as Pro-Vice Chancellor at the Ambedkar University. His area of interest include modern Indian history with a special focus on Indian national movement, communal politics, partition of the subcontinent, politics of language, Hindi and Urdu nationalism, identity politics, and social science teaching. I would like to invite Professor Mishra to kindly talk over the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sanjay ji. I am indeed very indebted to Deshkal Society for initiating me, for giving me this opportunity to be a party to what promises to be an extremely fascinating and exciting and important discussion. I had the opportunity to go through some parts of the book. I think it's a very important book which clearly has a theoretical dimension and an empirical dimension, and the two components are very nicely interwoven together, very entangled, in a very entangled kind of a way. The empirical component, as Sanjay ji just pointed out, it's about the worldview of this Musahar community of South Bihar. The book provides a view of the community from outside, but also from the inside, the self-image of the community through its leaders. So that is a very important component of the book. But there is also a theoretical component of the book which really critiques the dominant model of development for its hegemony and for depriving the world of its diversity, which was so characteristic of pre-modern life. So this flattening out, there is a book that the writers really complain about this. The book also, because it deals with the dominant model of development, the book also discusses conceptually the idea of marginality. And clearly the book has more than one ways of looking at it, both the introduction and Arvind Mishra's article, because they deal with they constitute the theoretical component of the book. There is, for instance, a very clear celebration of marginality for its philosophical richness, for its refusal to submit and submerge, and for retaining the capacity to show alternative ways, because these alternative ways are not going to come from the mainstream, they are going to come from these marginal corners which have managed to retain their independence. But at the same time, there is also a kind of bewilderment at how these marginalities were created, the dislocation, the deprivation. Now, that's obviously not something one can celebrate. So you can see that the book, in a way, the volume, it's an important volume. It creates a range of responses on these crucial questions of marginalization, alternatives, mainstream, and you get a sense that it does oscillate between these two kind of streams, but it has both the views. I would like to now start the discussion, and our chief speaker, Professor Gyan Prakash. We have about 4 or 5 speakers, and they have all agreed. Professor Gyan Prakash has agreed to speak for about 20 minutes, and other speakers have agreed to take about 15 minutes. Professor Gyan Prakash is a professor of history at Princeton University. His specialization is in modern India. His major areas are urban modernity, colonial genealogy of modernity, problems of post-colonial thought and politics. His book, Bonded Histories, Genealogies of Labor Certitude in Colonial India, has now become a kind of a classic. It's sort of one of its kind. It really initiated a very new kind of discourse. Also, his book on emergency came as a very pleasant surprise to some of us. We didn't really expect it, especially for its capacity to zoom out of the 70s and go to the 50s, 60s, and the 50s, and creating a very, very different kind of matrix within which questions of emergency needed to be looked at. So I think it was really a historian's view of the emergency. So I would like to invite Professor Gyan Prakash to give us his views on the book. Professor Gyan Prakash.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Okay. So thank you, Professor Salil Mishra, for that very generous introduction. And thank you, the organizers of this seminar, for inviting me for this discussion of the book, The Marginalized Self. First, I want to congratulate the editors and the writers and everyone associated with the project that led to this volume. It's no secret that there is a dearth of scholarship on Dalit communities in India, although it is growing day by day. And by assembling these richly researched essays on the Musahar community in Bihar, I think the volume makes a significant contribution to what is now a growing body of scholars. I want to start my discussion of the book by first placing it in the larger field of Indian scholarship. I want to suggest that it offers a stinging critique, to which Professor Mishra has also referred to, of Indian scholarship, politics, state, development, and education. Let me elaborate this point. And if you'll indulge me, I will do so by going through some of my personal history. I did my schooling in Bihar. I did my graduate degree in Delhi University and my master's in JNU. But throughout my education, I never once was offered a book or an article on these marginalized communities. When I entered JNU in the 1970s, it was at that point supposed to be and was a new kind of scholarship that we were exposed to. But much of our work, much of our curriculum really consisted of studies on Indian nationalism, on colonialism, on Gandhi, Nehru, a little bit of Ambedkar, but not very much. And working class movements, Mauryas, Guptas, Mughal Empire, and so on. We read about the caste system, but we read it as a kind of an account of a sociological system. We never read about the experience of Dalits and lower castes within the caste system. Of course, growing up in Bihar, I knew about the Musahar community, but only through the dominant caste stereotypes, which the book documents very richly. It's when I started my PhD research on bonded labor in Bihar that I began to put together the history of bonded labor and the Bhuiya community together, which before I began the study, the connections I hadn't seen. As a historian, I naturally first went to the archives. And I found that the documents that I was seeing in the archives had already a kind of a history written for me. The concept of bonded labor as unfree labor, the idea that bonded laborers were members of the so-called untouchable caste, all of that was already kind of written into it. But the perspective was very much from above and from the point of view of the state. Um, and it was a kind of a trajectory where it was seen as if with the progress of modernity, things like slavery and bonded labor come to an end, and wage labor becomes the sign of modernity. So there was this kind of historical narrative that was already present uh, in uh, in the archive. And I remember at that point that during the emergency, bonded labor had been abolished. Uh, and when I got into the archive, I saw that it was abolished in 1920. So why was it again abolished? I started asking these questions, and of course, I remember when I would tell people, that I was doing a history of bonded labor. People would say, "Oh, bonded labor in Bihar, of course. Bihar to hai hi feudal. वहाँ तो ऐसा होता ही है." So there was this kind of a trajectory where Bihar was a sign of pre-modernity, and bonded labor naturally existed over there. So I became very dissatisfied both with the kind of a discourse around that I was hearing, as well as what I was encountering in the archives. And that actually got me to actually go to the area. And, I was very naive, and I just went to to Bodh Gaya, and I remember I went to a pawn shop over there, and, asked people in the pawn shop, तो ये है यहाँ पे बंधुआ मजदूर कहाँ रहते हैं, they laughed at me and so on. But anyway, slowly I found my feet, and I started working particularly in a village called Bakror, which was just across the river. And I spent a year there, and started collecting these oral traditions of the Bhuiya community. And as I started, living with these, Bhuiya community in Bakror, and started collecting these traditions, this experience taught me that the Indian state, the ruling castes, classes, Indian education, archives, historical writings were all deeply implicated in denying these groups their history and their agency in history. Of course, as a scholar, I could not restore to the Bhuiyas what had been denied to them in history. People often speak about recovering history or restoring agency. But I found that when history had, in actual practice, denied them that agency, denied them that position, as a historian, it would be arrogant for me to come there and say, I will restore your agency. I couldn't. History had denied them. And I think this is the meaning of, Gayatri Spivak's famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? That power relations do not permit and have not permitted historically these marginalized communities to speak for themselves, to become autonomous subjects. And so, as a historian, what are we supposed to do? What do critical scholars do? They can, as the contributors of the marginalized self do, is to track the process by which the Musahar community's history has been erased. For it is in tracking that process of erasure that you can identify the suppressed presence of the Musahar community, the suppressed presence, the trace of the subaltern. I'm here sort of going back to, Ranajit Guha's famous essay, The Prose of Counterinsurgency, where he speaks about how the insurgent is available or present as a trace in the elite discourses, because the elite discourses are constantly haunted by the presence of the insurgent, by the presence of the rebel. So that is one way in which, through the very process of studying and analyzing the presence of the stereotypes that has kind of enveloped the life of the Musar community, that you can actually register the presence of the Musars in history, and which is what I think the volume does very effectively. So let me turn now specifically to the way the book tracks the suppression of the Musar community. And one way the essays address this issue is by examining development discourses and practices. What they show is that the state and the dominant castes engage with the Mushars through long established stereotypes. They're rat hunters and eaters, they're unclean, they're wandering communities, they're alcoholic, and so on. A whole series of stereotypes. And as I said, earlier, I remember these stereotypes sort of growing up in Bihar. It was, routinely sort of said. So when I was in Patna, and in Patna also, there are these, Mushar neighborhoods, and people would often refer to them through these stereotypes. So what the volume does is to present us with those stereotypes and show how the development experts and the whole development regime is not innocent of these stereotypes. And in fact, when they try to explain why development has failed, or what's referred to as implementation deficit, they often refer to these stereotypes. And the argument is that if the development has failed, it has failed because of the Mushars, because they are a wandering community. That's why we cannot give them, homestead under Indira Awas Yojana. They are uneducated and they're illiterate, and therefore they cannot utilize the fruits of development. So implementation deficit is another way to explain away the failure to achieve the development goals. By placing the responsibility on the Mushars themselves. So as I read through the essays, it became clear that the essays bring into the question the concept of development itself. In a way, this is not new, and the volume actually refers to a whole body of literature that for several years now, or decades, has criticized the top-down modernist view of development, about its elitism, about its neglect of culture. But this is no accident. After all, development in the Indian context functions within the framework of caste and class dominance. Development is not innocent of it. Caste prejudices are written into development. Should we not then see development, to quote Ranajit Guha's term, a counter-insurgent discourse? That is, the state presents itself as offering betterment of people's lives through various development strategies. But perhaps it is this promise to improve conditions should be seen as a state strategy to manage the population, to bring it within the ambit of state practices. And one can say that even about the electoral discourses. What these electoral discourses and practices do is to bring these communities within the ambit and within the functioning of the Indian state. It is no surprise then that when development fails, when the state practices to govern the population come up short, a whole battery of caste stereotypes are marshaled as explanations. So you begin with, or the state begins within the kind of framework of caste and class, tries to bring in the Musahar community within its development practices. And when it fails, as a sort of tautology, it harks back to the same caste and class prejudices and say, well, this is why it failed. So, in a way, I'm asking whether we should think about development not at its face value, but see it as a strategy of governmentality. It's kind of Foucaultian term. It's an attempt to manage the population and bring it within the dominant goals of the state. So that's the first question I want to raise about the volume and what it says about development. One of the most kind of productive things that the volume does. Sorry, there's some background noise somewhere.
Yeah, no, please carry on. Yeah.
Okay. I think one of the most productive things that the book does is that it takes the very site of failure of development to open up a view of the Musar community. And this is what Professor Salil Mishra was also referring to about, its ethnographic work, its ethnographic work in collecting the Musahar, folklore, myths, traditions, and so on. And this is, I think, very important to acknowledge. I mean, this is an acknowledgement of subaltern knowledge. I remember that when I first started working in Bakror and was spending time with Bhuiyas and living with them, and a Brahmin teacher in the village once he sat me down and he said, "Time waste kar rahe hain aap. What are you doing? These people are illiterate, they're uneducated, they don't know anything. What can they tell you? You will know nothing. They don't even know about their own history. You should talk to me, and I will tell you the history of the village and about its land and even about the Bhuiyas." So there was a kind of a denigration of subaltern knowledge, that what they know is not worth anything. Okay? So the fact that the volume takes subaltern knowledge seriously is, I think, an enormously positive and important thing, a contribution that the volume makes. Unfortunately, I also ignored the advice of this teacher and went on to collect their traditions. And I'm glad to see that the authors of the essays in the volume also do a wonderful job of delving into the community's history, its folklore, its myths, its experiences. This is important because it brings to light what is unknown. People who, scholars who have grown up in, as I know, as I have grown up in India, I had no idea before I started doing any work in the Bhuya community, that there was this whole kind of a repertoire of knowledge that was there, which we didn't know about. So I think it's very important that it brings to light this knowledge. But it's also important because it means respect for their subjectivity. It's not just bringing something to light, but also giving it value. Now, given the disrespect for subaltern knowledge by dominant caste and the erasure of their representations in favor of upper caste stereotypes, the act of retrieving the Musar story is a real service that this volume provides. Not because it will make development more sensitive to the Musar culture. Although, that's been the discourse that the volume also refers to, starting with the UN's recognition of the need for cultural sensitivity. I don't have much hope there that, that knowledge of the Musar community will somehow make development more effective. I think the crucial question here is really that the respect and recognition for Musar culture is important because it rejects the epistemic protocols of power relations, and it shows how Musars, celebrate their community life and subvert domination. Okay, this leads me to the final point I want to make about the book and about the politics of Musar community. And I want to address this by taking a detour first. I want to turn to Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. I've been rereading Fanon for other reasons, and it just so happened that when I read The Marginalized Self, things that I had just been reading with Fanon seemed very relevant. Not in a mechanical sort of a way, but there are certain kinds of insights that are there in Fanon's work that I find relevant in thinking about the issues that the volume brings up. In Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon wrote about colonialism and said that it was a total system that shaped the psychic experience of the colonized, and hence the title Black Skin, White Masks. Because the title encapsulates the book's argument that anti-black racism had so deeply constituted the colonial world that the blacks had to act as white in order to gain any recognition at all. This kind of racialization, which reduces blacks to a kind of a non-being, being non-human and therefore fit for slavery, was accomplished by economic subjugation and then through the internalization of what Fanon called epidermalization. So the skin becomes really the identity. Blacks are nothing but their skin color, locked in their sort of a degraded nothingness, and their existence is then identified with cannibalism, primitivism, barbarity. And I was reading this, and then I was reading the book's description of various stereotypes about Musahars, and I couldn't but notice the kind of similarity where, again, the caste society defines Muslims through these kind of stereotypes, very akin to the kind of racialization that Fanon was talking about. And so Fanon, when he says that given that this is the only kind of a non-existence that blacks know in the colonial world, the only alternative that this world offers to them is masks, black skin, white masks. That's the only way that they can live in this world and gain any recognition. And so he says, I'm quoting, the black man has to wear the livery that the white man has sold, if he doesn't want to wallow in the degraded nothingness that anti-black racism has reduced his existence to. How do they get out of it? If this is such a total system, how do they get out of it? You know, Fanon talks about how the system creates such violence in it that violence also pervades a black life, and there's a great deal of intra-black violence because this whole system is so violent. But how do they get out of it? It's not just a matter of prejudice. The system is such that it's not just a matter of prejudice that could be overcome through education and, liberalism. It's not just you'll get educated, you'll get liberal education, and you'll lose your racist prejudice. Racism is built into the system. It's sort of baked into society, economy, culture, and so on. So as I was reading this Fanon, writing the Fanon, and I couldn't but help think of the caste system in a similar way, and how deeply it kind of bakes our society, our politics, our culture, that it's impossible to sort of think outside it. How do they get out of it? Now, in Fanon's case, he thinks that revolutionary will permit or will allow blacks to break this kind of racist colonial system. And, in his book, A Dying Colonialism, there's a wonderful account of the role of the veil in the Algerian Revolution. It's a chapter that I often give to my students. It's called Algeria Unveiled, and Fanon goes through the place of the veil in traditional Algerian culture, and how the veil was used as a way to kind of domesticate women and part of patriarchy, and how through the Algerian Revolution, the veil's meaning is transformed. And it's almost like, when I read that chapter, it's almost like Fanon was writing the script for the film, The Battle of Algiers. And if you've seen the film, Battle of Algiers, there's obviously he didn't write the script, but you can see the point he's making, where he says, so what happens during the Algerian Revolution is Algerian women wear the burqa, the veil, to pass through French, guards and soldiers in order to carry bombs and blow up these sort of cafes. And so the meaning of the veil, which is supposed to kind of domesticate women, is transformed by the revolution into something else. He has some really wonderful passages about how this revolutionary will then transforms the meaning of traditional culture. So I was thinking similarly that how would one think of Musahar culture, of which one has wonderful portraits in the book? How will that culture become more sort of a dynamic and think of it in action rather than just a kind of an ethnographic portrait, but that culture becomes part of Musar politics. And so this might be, one of the things that, one could take away from the book is that although there is a portrait of this culture and an account of how this culture, enables Mushars to question their domination. But I'm wondering if one could push this even further and ask to what extent this culture can be portrayed in motion, in some kind of a dynamic relationship with politics. There are, three sort of very fascinating accounts of Dashrath Manjhi and others, which shows an attempt by Musahars themselves to overcome various kinds of impediments placed before them. But these are largely individual stories of kind of individual agency and initiative. And I'm wondering about if the way in which one can think of how that individual initiative becomes part of some collective project. And in that kind of collective project, how does the Musahar cultural milieu act as a kind of a mediating agent and thereby changes its meaning. And so then we think of the Musahar culture not as a kind of a traditional anthropological sort of entity, but something that is in motion and in dynamism. So these are my kind of comments on the book, and so take it for what they are, and we can end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Gyan Prakash, for that wonderful, fascinating journey. It had so many dimensions. It started with a kind of anthropological dimension, your own individual life and your own research journeys. And then there was this great sense of big picture. There was really what I was fascinated by was this sense of big picture in which you could draw comparisons. So a combination of your own experiences with the big picture and the tiny details, the kind of blinkers come with a vision of development. So there is a kind of a circularity or a tautology about it. Anyway, we'll think more about what you said. It was just wonderful. Can I now invite Professor Rajkumar, join him into the discussion. Professor Rajkumar is currently the head of department at English in the University of Delhi. His major areas of interest and research are Dalit literature, Indian literature, autobiography, post-colonial studies, literary criticism, and also Odia literature. So, Professor Rajkumar, can I now request you to come and join the discussion?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Mishra. Good evening to everyone. I first congratulate all the authors. Wonderful book. Also thank Sanjay for having invited me to this very interesting discussion. Professor Gyan Prakash has already made the field open. So what I'll do for next 15 minutes, that is the time given, I would like to bring some of the interiorities, that both partly from the book and partly from, that how it open up a larger discussion. One, that I found this book quite interesting. Before that, I had already read, I don't know how many of you have read, there is a Bengali anthology of short story called Survival and Other Stories, which I had a chance to review in Indian literature. This is Sahitya Academy Journal. Wonderful story. Survival is all about it's just like, that in Bihar it is called Musahar, but I'm sure as sociologists and anthropologists or even common man, if we go around India, I'm from Odisha, Bihar, Bengal, almost the same, where paddy cultivations are being, that done. And I, in my childhood, if I can, give my example, that we had also, like Musahar, broken the rat hole in order to retrieve the paddy that is being hidden in the rat hole. And this story that I referred to, Survival, there is a character Rajavan, who has to fight along the cobra. Quite a dangerous act, actually. That. So Musahar community, if they are eating rat, not because they are habitually rat eaters. This is the gift from a society which is caste bounded. So I will go to the extent by saying that whether it is rat eaters, beef eaters, carrion eaters, this is the gift from Indian caste society. Now, that so the book is not just confined to, as Professor Gyan Prakash has already, that versus and lecture indicated what could be the collective action. Now, I will just, that do a little touring of Indian society in general and come back to Musahar community in particular, and then tell, that some of the things that is, that very much relevant for the book that we are going to discuss. What I want to tell you is that this 1.4 million people, those who are called Musahar or Musahar Bhuya, as we know, they are the victims of Indian caste society. That caste rules, which is the governing principle. We might think that, that we are in modern India or post-colonial India or even post-liberal India, but caste is the fact of life. And that's why there are two articles in the book where they also refer to Professor Gyan Prakash's thesis that whether Musahar community, they were free before they were being trapped by Indian caste laws to become Kamya, the laborers. This is a question that I would like you to think about. It's just like, that question whether the chicken came first or the egg. It is actually, that if we go by Indian history, I must refer to that if we go back to, say, Indus Valley civilization, there were no reference to caste, some kind of class division. And then in once Aryan came, and then there were Varna system, and as we all know, Varna became Jati, and we do not know at what point of time who made it. But then, that we have different names given to people. So it is not a matter of 1.4 billion million Musahar community. Look at the epithet that we have in Indian history: Shudra, Atishudra, Panchama, Antyaja, Chandala, Rakshasa, Harijan. These are some of the terms. It is just equivalent to, that what Musahar community are, untouchable. Now, please also go to the extent by saying that untouchable is not just untouchable. They are also unhearable, unapproachable, unseeable. No, I can go on extending. And as Gopal Guru has already indicated, Dalits who constitute 18% population. Look at, that Musahar is just one part of scheduled caste community in India. 18% population are called untouchables in India. And they are, because that what Ambedkar talked about, broken man, actually Gopal Guru goes to the extent by using the term walking carrion, because they eat beef or carrion. They are the one who are untouchable and always to be, that. So the authors also refer to two heinous practices that the Musahar community at one point of time earlier being, that asked to follow. The heinous practice, as there are several caste rules. Whenever you go about, we have 220 Dharma Shastra. These are the rule books. And if I can just give you 2 or 3 heinous practices in India, that they have to carry, ardent pot around their neck so that their sputum do not fall and pollute the upper caste. Another practice was to tie a bell, maybe so that every time they go, there will be sound, and the upper caste, they are aware of about untouchable coming. Or even, that tying broom at their back so that their footprints are erased, so that the upper caste they walk. So if the epithet for Musahar is say untouchable, they are they are the people those who eat both rat as well as also carrion. It is not because that this is the only community who are that used to eat that carrion. This is the whole that Dalit community. So what I'm just that I want to tell you that pig eaters, beef eaters, rat eaters are there all over India. So Musahars are no exception actually. Now the questions, that as the book promises, at one point of time, this is a kind of documenting their knowledge and particularly the cultural aspect, so that the development discourse could be counter, in Indian context. Now, when it comes to development, for example, as Professor Gyan Prakash has already made a comment about that, it is the governmentality. I will go to the extent by saying that that when it comes to development, whose development? Definitely Musahars are the victims of the development. But when it comes to development discourse in India, it is the top-down model, bureaucratic, definitely apathy. What I I can go to the extent by using, and here I would like to quote the development expert like Robert Chambers, who has 2 good books for every development expert, and that I would like to refer to this. That Putting the Last Fast. This is the first book that he wrote, Putting the Last Fast, and the second book is Putting the Fast Last, because the Musahars are the last, and that's why that we have to, if suppose that we have to think about alternative development, because the development paradigm is in paralytic condition, as one article suggests, putting the last fast, and that is where that the cultural or knowledge of the Musahar community, or for that matter any other Dalit community or tribal community that we are trying to think about their development comes first. So, but then Indian society is hypocritical, as we all know. We have many slogans, no, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, but then that it is because of that gap between theories and praxis. And here I would like to refer to that the kind of knowledge that is being retrieved from Musahar community. For example, there are two articles also refers to how over the years Musahars have become self-reliant. Some of them, of course, meaning not just, of course, I'll touch later maybe Dasarath Madhi and Bhagavati Devi and maybe another one or two. But Sanjay's article, for example, clearly suggests that the kind of trade and business now the Musahar community, for example, selling of pork, and then it is really being enjoyed by the upper caste, but they will not openly, that have this in the market. They will sneak maybe at the dark of the night, eating, maybe fried pork. This is reminded of even Om Prakash Valmiki's Jutan also says this, that the Tyagis, particularly who are upper caste Brahmin in UP, they will sneak into Dalit Basti in the night or evening to eat beef, fresh, that fried beef. And this is what I'm talking about, how Indian society is basically hypocritical. Because what we do in public, we do not do in the maybe private. Now this is actually that this will take us to the debate that started early part of 19th century. I will go to the extent by referring to say Phule and Ambedkar basically, because Phule for that matter, who started what is called Satya Sodhak Samaj. What is truth about Indian society? Satya, that as we know, he suggested in his book Gulamgiri, the book that he wrote in 1871, where major deconstruction on Indian caste myth particularly. And here I am reminded of, that how Musahar communities are also, the countering upper caste myth. I have no time to actually, that elaborate about, but let's come to Phule, who started a tradition to question the whole idea of caste as slavery. Caste is nothing but slavery. Why slavery? Because, that 85% people who are called Dalit Bahujan in India, they are the producer of this country. But the irony is that the producers in India are not the consumers. This is the irony. Look at, that the statistic, that if you have new statistic, at least, that last week or just 2 weeks back, 80% of our resources, national resources I'm talking about, are just, that in the hand of 20% population of this country. So if at all you are talking about development discourse or poverty for that matter, look at, that how many years we have been trying to eradicate poverty. Every year, people, those who are falling below poverty line increasing. Now, that there are several statistics. I'm not a sociologist, I'm not economist, but I can give you that the statistics suggest that from 36% from government of India data to 46%, and it goes to 72%. Tendulkar report and many others, United Nations, that 72%, 76% people in India could be falling under below poverty line. So where do we go? If at all you talk about development discourse, whose development we are talking about? Now, that. So I'm here very sure about, of course, that the idea of development that is coming from above, as we all know, top-down model, and our, that Indian state is becoming more and more, that it is evading responsibility with, that after neoliberalization, there are many, that spheres of life where there are no responsibility. Look at education, look at health, And the pandemic, perhaps, that is the best example whereby caste also revisits. So I will not go into detail. Now, that if I can give one example, that who are the people who brought corona to India, for example, or any part of the world. And we have been, that told that you have to wash your hand at least 3 times for 20 seconds. Where are waters? Where do people, that even there are no tap water, no drinking water. Dalit women have to travel around as there is, that I have to refer to Anupama Rao's edited book, Caste and Gender, where she talks about that Dalit men and women, after putting 8 hours of hard work, Dalit women have to travel another 3 kilometers to collect fuel and water for cooking. And in the process, they will be again victimized by the upper caste, landlords and moneylenders. So where do we go? The development discourse that we talk about has several dimensions, that where, that there is no one way to, talk about. Now, with the bureaucratic, that apathy and, that Indian society, as that we are going through, one thing, that one proper perspective on development, that as we all know, that that's why, that people like Jignesh and others, the Dalit leaders, they are telling, because as I have already pointed out earlier, that nearly 70% Dalit will be landless and homeless. And that's why Jignesh Mewani, Dalit leader, that his demand is to give 5 acres of land. That's the concrete, that development, if at all Dalit have to survive. Now, that, of course, that the reference that is given in the book, Dasarath Maji and Bhagavati Devi, and of course, there are 2 others, Baleshwar Prasad and his wife Jayanti Devi. These are some of the example of how the idea of critical consciousness coming to Dalit. In the case of Dasarath Maji, I don't think, that I will go to the extent telling Professor Gyan Prakash saying that Dasarath Maji example is not limited to Musahar community, not just Dalit community, because, that here there is a big question. Whenever we talk about any successful story, say Ambedkar is always being, that quoted as Dalit leader. Why can't we see Ambedkar as a national figure who thinks about India as a whole? So Dasarath Maji's example, that the person who put hard work, almost, that gave his life, is not just for Musahar community. I don't think, that it is for the whole of India. So the critical consciousness that we, that referred to in the context of Dasarath Maji and others, I will, that here, of course, we are reminded of Paulo Freire. And what is very interesting about Paulo Freire is that, that it is not just critical consciousness. Dalit, of course, that I should not here talk about that. For example, Professor Prakash also talked about the subaltern cannot speak, that the famous. Now, with the Dalit writings coming in a big way, Dalits have already proved that the subaltern not only can, that speak, they can also write. And that's where the establishment of Dalit study all over the world is a new beginning for the marginal communities to not only make their presence felt, but they are also rewriting India's history, culture, language, literature in a big way. I should not talk actually about, that how new aesthetic is coming, how the language, that say, Bama, if you have read, that she doesn't write Sanskrit Tamil, but, that the everyday language of ordinary and common people. So, definitely with the coming of Dalit literature, Dalits have made made their presence felt. Now the whole idea here is, that why I'm talking about is this book is talking in a big way about deconstructing Indian history, also Indian myth. For example, that the example that is given, either, that there are one or two essay, Badiran Narayana's Myth, Culture and Democracy, where the myth of Deosi and Dina Badari. Actually, these are, the deconstruction of Indian myth. How Indian upper caste myths are being not only, the deconstructed, but there is also new perspective to see Indian society in a big way. That is what, that Phule did, and many of the Dalit writers are doing, whether they are talking about, say, Sudra Sambhuka or Ekalavya, or, that there are many myths. So, Deosi and Dina Badri are two myths that is being, that referred to in this book. Now, that, so, that these are some of the ways, that Musahar communities are trying to retrieve what is being lost in the process. Because otherwise they are rat eaters, they are untouchable, they are, that the one who has no knowledge, no literacy, no culture, and that's where they are to be, that pushed down to the margin. I think, that the very presence of myth making is a big way to counter Indian culture, Indian myth. And so I will go to the extent by saying that even a small token of documenting their myth will go in a big way to rewrite Indian history. Now to come to perhaps the conclusion, because Professor Mishra, you have to tell me the time. What I need perhaps that to urge the authors, because this is the finished product. There are that ways and means to perhaps that go to the field, and then perhaps that maybe that rewrite history of Musahar community. What I would suggest, that the way some of the stories are being documented, definitely they are going to make their presence felt to what we say, that knowledge, because knowledge is power. Knowledge power, that Foucault, I should not remind it, that is what, that the domination, and because in Indian society, knowledge is being used as domination. And that's why, that even for this book, what I felt lacking is, I was just thinking about, how to bring a critique to this book. So hope, that the authors don't mind if I say Professor Arvind Mishra is there, and that I'm sure Sanjay and others are there. Where are the agency? That there are one or two questions I would like to maybe put. Like if we are going to perhaps that rewrite history of Musahar community, can we think about taking another project maybe, whereby we can take, say, interviews, or what is called life writing, that when people cannot write their life history, we can always document them. That is what. Yeah. So so maybe that one or two things that I need to perhaps that suggest to Deshkal maybe, or the authors, because they are really into it. I'm so happy that this book actually brings lot many areas. It is not just that development discourse, also education, myth, history, economy, and that anthropology, sociological understanding. Meaning these are some of the areas. But what is missing perhaps is where are the voices of Musahar community. So maybe that if we can indulge in maybe taking interviews, one or two, taking their viewpoint, perhaps that the next project could be more maybe that vibrating, and that is what I was just that trying to suggest. So thank you. Perhaps that I conclude by saying that nevertheless the book has opened up a kind of discussion, and the dialogue that is being made will definitely go a long way, not only for the readers to enrich themselves about Musahar community, also Musahar community will be definitely being benefited by giving some kind of at least secondary knowledge, I can say, if I can use this word, secondary knowledge, if not the primary. So thank you for your patient listening. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Rajkumar. Can I now invite Mr. Manish Sinha? Mr. Manish Sinha is the Director General of the National Institute of Communication Finance in New Delhi. After completing his higher studies from St. Stephen's and University of Delhi, Mr. Sinha joined the Indian Post and Telecom Accounts and Finance Services in 1990. He has been the Deputy Director General there, and being an excellent public servant, he is very committed towards the preservation and dissemination of history and heritage of these communities in South Bihar region, particularly Bodh Gaya. So he's been really involved in this project. Can I now invite Mr. Manish Sinha with the request that I think all of you, all the speakers have agreed to stick to around 15 minutes per speaker. Thank you so much. Mr. Manish Sinha. Mr. Sinha, are you there? I saw you. I saw you there, but I can't see you now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, thank you. Good evening, Professor Mishra, Professor Gyan Prakash. Sir, I have been a student of history and heard of you very early in my life when I started reading history. Arvind Mohan ji, all the writers, and Sanjay ji, thank you for giving me this opportunity. To begin with, let me make it clear that I'm neither a researcher nor a history writer, or have little experience in this area of work. But recently, I've been associated with the works that Deshkal Society does. And what is perhaps goes in my favor is that I'm a resident of Gaya. My village is about 50 kilometers from Gaya. I have lived in that area for a very, very long time. And a lot of what has been written in the book is something, at least from the dominant caste side, I have a lot of experience in. And basically what I would like to do is take those experiences and relate it to the research that has been presented in this book. I've been working in the government for almost 30 years now. Read a lot of books, but this particular book was a totally unique kind of reading experience for me, because all the writers have actually gone down to a very, very small community and brought out all the details of their lifestyle, their culture, their livelihood experiences, and brought and wonderfully put it across to the reader through 5 wonderful essays. And for me, it was a real revelation. I've been living in Gaya for the past 4 decades or so. Of course, now in some ways we are all people living in Bihar who are working outside, are like migrants working in various cities in India. This set of 5 essays is actually a very granular and micro research into the history of a community about whom probably very little was known till this book came out, and I hope it becomes popular reading and is able to inform a large expanse of audience about what the situation of the Musa community is. My first encounter with this community was sometime in the 1970s, early 1970s, and I can say for sure from observation that their confidence has grown compared to what I had seen at those times, and their ability to influence political outcomes in the state of Bihar, or at least in the Gaya region, is much larger now. In the early 70s, as growing up as a child in the agricultural plains of the same region that our researchers have gone to, that is Central and South Bihar, I remember the kind of innocent excitement that we all experienced while watching the Bhuiya community members cleansing acres and acres of agricultural land of rats and rodents prior to the wet plantation of rice. For the children, it was a very enjoyable exercise, and if you look at the way it was done, we remember them lighting up the straw and pushing the burning straw in the holes to dig up the rodents, and finally capturing what popped out from under the earth. And not only in the fields, they performed the same exercise in the Halihan, the grain storage areas, and which was effective in reducing the wastage of grain for many a farmer. It has already been mentioned in the essays that because of their status and because of the position there in the caste hierarchy in the villages, these communities primarily lived at the outskirts of the villages, and there was little cultural interaction with the rest of the village. Initially, maybe in the 70s and 80s, I remember there was little or no role either in the political exercise or electoral exercise that was done every 5 years in the free democratic India as we started. So even from my own experience, it only confirms what the essayists have been writing, is that there was an extreme marginalization of this community, both in urban and rural parts of that region. Even amongst, there were laws, like there was a previous speaker who had spoken about untouchability and poverty. The free and modern India was making laws to take care that these the unaccepted behaviors were made, there were deterrents against them, and people were discouraged from practicing untouchability. Perhaps very dangerous now to practice them in the present society, or even actions of positive discrimination in the areas of education and in providing employment. So there was some kind of a growth that was happening for the scheduled caste and tribe. This book also places the Musahars or the Bhuiyas as to where they stand in terms of the other scheduled castes and tribes. And that's also a revelation that they have not been able to make a dent into their economic status or the social status because some others castes, even within the scheduled castes, have tended to dominate and take a maximum share of what comes in terms of the development that the state is able to reach to this very, very lower sections of the society there. I would also look at some of the essays specifically and say that the first of the essays it does argue about the lack of recognition of the exclusive culture of the marginalized community and the way it has been ignored by the development design by the nation state in our country. It is very often difficult to understand that how do these macro development plans take care of the culture of the local and marginalized communities. And unless these stories of the way the Mushars and the Bhuiya communities or similar castes of marginalized castes of this kind, it is recognized that their opposition and resistance to certain kind of change is recognized at the lowest level. It is very, very difficult to bring them uniformly into the, to give a positive outcome to the development plans that are made for the lowest level of the administrative units in the government. Plans are normally made at a very high, macro level, and then by the time they reach the panchayat or even lower villages, the effect normally gets lost, and that is the concern that comes out from this essay. I was reminded of reading some of these development economic theories in the late 90s, where some prominent economists of the World Bank, IMF, while making policy prescriptions for the new economy, at one time erroneously described corruption as a grease for development in the underdeveloped countries. Largely because people who were visiting these countries, they realized that it was not possible to work with the kind of bureaucratic structures they had without allowing some kind of a leakage of from the funds that they were providing for economic development. So perhaps it was a recognition that corruption was a cultural habit and therefore deeply ingrained in these communities, and that satisfying this greed would only help drive economic growth. Of course, a lot of it, the fallacy of it all was recognized later on, and this practice was totally abandoned. But this led to a truly disastrous effect on the geopolitics as well as the political development in various regions of Africa, where countries, and they still suffer from autocratic governments, perpetual civil conflicts, people trying to gather control of the resources as well as the natural resources, which were meant to be used for development of these communities. So, in a way, this essay does bring in the issue of that opposition and the resistance of the Bhumiya community to accept the narrative of development that comes from the top, and the way it is expressed in their community folk songs and other rebellious means of expressing in their literature. It's a voice that needs to be heard by the people who design development, and necessary effects and changes be made so that a more inclusive kind of a development plan can be made. In the second essay, besides the history, what I find fascinating is the writer identifies the geographical location of this community in the various parts of Bihar and UP. And he also writes about the various myths popular in the community, and interestingly, the parallels that it draws from the Brahmanical tradition. So there is the story of Sabri, and that is perhaps common to a large number of scheduled castes all over the country. And but the Mushars also depend on it to glorify their presence or their representation in the most prominent Hindu epic. And perhaps it shows that they have a inherent desire to be recognized more than what they are, and to establish their own identity, and to build up a higher status in the Hindu social hierarchy. There are many more myths and legends that are described in the essay, which describes heroes, people holding forts. One very interesting, which I didn't know, and I'm now informed, is about Pipri, and the fact that there is a fort there, and people still associate emotionally with that area and the hero. So these myths and legends, about which we know next to nothing, is something that the dominant communities may have been totally ignorant of till the late last century, and that may be one of the reasons why the dominance, though of course there was an economic reason for the dominant caste to conduct themselves in that manner, but not knowing the social and the cultural capital, as the writer calls it, also gives the strength to the dominant community to put down these communities as non-achievers in the social and cultural arena, and therefore they may not be given any significance in their interactions in that area. So, given that they are very small in number, and that there is a sporadic presence in various regions of UP and Bihar, and they don't make a dominant number in any particular region, their consolidation by use of this culture capital is absolutely essential to enhance their impact, even in the electoral discourse in the nation, or to bring about any significant changes in the social status that is ascribed to them. And Ahmed's analysis and implementation of the Indira Awas Yojana does bring out a very significant aspect of the failure of on the part of development planners, and that has been recognized. I'm aware that Deshkal is doing some other works related to it, like digitization of the land records, and trying to arrive at to bring data out to know how many people actually own homestead land in these areas, and some of it has been published. There are other works they are bringing out, and the attempt to build houses for the poor without giving them a right to the land on which these houses are made shows a total lack of imagination on the planners, and perhaps these are the kind of information that is vital for the government to recognize and ensure that adequate land reforms and creation of land rights is done in an adequate manner, so that all these individuals who are given the benefit to make makans, are able to build these houses there. So I remember in the early 70s when we were told that roti, kapda or makan were the three essentials that all the poor need to be provided for. The elusive makan doesn't come because of these failures that have been very, very effectively recognized by the essayist here. He also traces the wandering or gypsy identity of the community, having its genesis in the Chota Nagpur hills and then later on settling in the agricultural plains of Bihar. He's probably trying to trace the reason why the Bhuya community or the Musas never had homestead right on the land that they lived in. So probably since they were never tied to a geographical region, and were very easily able to move from one village to or one region to another. This kind of a right was never created for them. In my childhood, I remember one of the major problems that the dominant castes had, and while they were good at removing the rodents, I used to see that at the end of the agricultural activity, there was a lot of politics in the village amongst the dominant caste to somehow prevent theft of the grain, the bojas that they used to make in the fields. And a lot of youth from the larger families would be deployed to ensure that the bojas were shifted to the khalihans in the right numbers. And there was a lot of, people did not trust. There was a total lack of trust on the community, probably arising from these reasons that they were never permanent in a particular villages. So some kind of the community system maybe to some extent tried to tie down the Mushars to the villages, and but that also probably for one generation or so, and it never passed on to the other generation. So from the research, it is recognized that these permanent homestead rights in villages where they settled was not coming to them even after performing labor for almost all the large landowners in this area. So this new development in the 19th century probably converted them into landless laborers. And now in the modern times, as we have seen lately, one of the impacts of COVID, that this community is also a part of the very large section of migrant laborers that have been contributing to the manufacturing and small services sector of the Indian economy in the cities. You could see how many of them have gone back, and Professor Rajkumar mentioned the sheer size of the numbers in which they've gone back, and the numbers that are to be provided with assistance in terms of food and part-time livelihood activity. That itself shows how deeply entrenched poverty still is in some of these marginalized and societies at the lowest level of the caste hierarchy. So there is a point in the essay that the housing projects in the rural areas need to take care of creation of clear homestead rights for the small and marginalized communities in the village who perform an important economic role in the economy of rural India. Sanjay ji, of course, he's brought out something that was which was a new information to me. I have been a resident of Gaya continuously till the first decade of this millennium. But I was not aware of this important change in the food notions that was happening in the area. Maybe because it's a development that has gained much more activity in the recent years. But his study of the rising value of pig rearing by the Mushar community and increasing consumption of pork in the diet of the residents of Gaya was quite a revelation to me. And many other residents of Gaya who have been informing in the last few days and asking them whether what was their experience about it. But there is a clear analogy. And if I look back at this city, Gaya city in the 70s and 80s, the eating habits were changing even at those times. And I remember that there was an increasing use of the poultry meat products. If you look at Gaya, and some of the researchers who've been there in those times would remember that Mutton used to be the main meat item consumed in the city and the surrounding rural areas. Even the use of chicken was uncommon, and its use was associated at those times with a minority community. So the increasing use of poultry, egg, and chicken, and its marketing including by some of the agencies of the government, had itself started transforming eating habits and differentiation between communities. The cultural boundaries that exist between a vegetarian and non-vegetarian community that exist almost all over the country, and examples are seen in various places in Rajasthan, Gujarat, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh. These have to some extent been diluted by the increasing use of poultry products in the various urban areas in the country. So I was automatically drawn to this argument in this essay that eating pork by various castemen in this region had led to, in some ways, greater acceptance of the marginalized community and was definitely helping in the economic upliftment of the community. Going by the experience or analogy regarding the poultry products, it has been easy to accept this argument, and it's a pleasing information for a lot of us who belong to this region that we have in some way experienced change due to the changing food habits in our area of where our house is located. The last of the essays, Mr. Mishra's, where he lays down parameters that could be measured to see whether what community is developed or underdeveloped. And he goes on to argue that the industrialized development discourse proposed a similar way of determining what development means and the way it characterizes societies as developed or underdeveloped. In the popular discourse in developing economies, including that of India, it is common for intellectuals to link all socio-political problems to reasons of economic underdevelopment. Very often the Western writings have led us to think in that way, but we often stop short of designing alternate parameters to measure how these marginalized communities perceive development and how they can be brought into the mainstream. It is very well to say that culture capital and social capital have their role, but there must be some quantifiable parameter to measure and bring forward the knowledge that in what ways can we measure whether a particular society has been reached a certain stage of development or has not. Now, there are established norms like popularization of modern education that promotes rational thinking, and whether this uniform method itself will lead to better status for the marginalized society or create a universal identity for them, or this uniformity in the outcome of objection has already been pushed very far as an accepted positive state action. The arguments in this essay are often far removed from the macro understanding that modern education does help to dilute not only the social political domination of certain castes, but also gives uniform access to economic means that create a more acceptable livelihood for all communities in society. So finally, the whole book is actually an exercise in establishing that there is a certain self-confidence that these communities have acquired. And I would just like to relate one important a member of this community who was
Mr. Sinha, can I just request you that we have two more speakers to go?
Okay, I'll just take 2 minutes. I'm reaching the end.
Please. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Just 2 minutes.
Yes, please.
So there was a Musar MLA from my town. He ultimately became the chief minister of the state. And when he went to Bombay, there was one of the leading news channel reporters asked him that, do you eat rats? And very simply and very confidently, he replied, yes, I do. And there was a lot of controversy surrounding it, whether the question should have been asked. And some people also winced away from the kind of answer he gave. But it shows that there is a certain self-confidence and a new identity that is emerging. And we need to recognize that and take it as forward as possible. And this exercise of bringing so many aspects of this community in these essays is perhaps a step in that. So thank you very much. I'm running short of time, so this is all that I had to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sinha. I would now like to invite Arvind Mohan ji. Arvind Mohan ji is a journalist. He has 30 years of journalism, rich experience. He's been a journalist with Janasatta, with India Today, Hindustan Times, Amar Ujala. Hello, yes, please. Yeah. So Mr. Arvind Mohan has been with a journalist. Hello, is there an obstruction somewhere? Yeah. Let me.
जो हम बता रहे हैं
संजीव जी संजीव जी अपना माइक्रोफोन ऑफ कर लीजिए प्लीज।
नहीं सुनिए ना सर, आप जो है ना वो डायरेक्ट जो है वो
Okay, fine. There was some crosstalk. So he's been a journalist with Janasatta, India Today, Hindustan Times, Amar Ujala. Arvind ji is known for his astute understanding of finance and economics. He also worked as the editor, quality control for Hindustan Times. He has published innumerable books, but the one which I find particularly important is the book on Gandhi in Champaran. I thought that was a very important book which brought out so many important facets of Gandhi's experiment in Champaran. For historians like us, it was absolutely a wonderful revelation. So can I now request Arvind Mohan ji to come and give us his ideas on the book? Arvind Mohan. Arvind ji, can you hear me? Where are you? Arvind ji, are you, can I? Arvind ji, will you please respond? Are you there? Or will the organizers find out? Will Deshkal Society find out whether he's there or he's left? He was certainly there at the beginning of the discussion. Maybe in which case, what I would suggest is that since Arvind ji is probably not there with us for the moment, maybe he'll come back. So can I then go on to our fifth speaker, who's actually now the fourth speaker, and can I request Arvind Kumar Mishra? He's actually one of the authors of the volume, so he will talk about his piece as well as the entire volume. Dr. Arvind Kumar Mishra is at the Zakir Hussain Center for Educational Studies, JNU. His prime interest is in social psychology, marginality, alternative development, and he has written about these things in his article. So can I then go over to Dr. Arvind Mishra and request Dr. Mishra to give us his ideas on the volume, on the making of the volume, and then we can come back to Arvind Mohan. So Dr. Arvind Mishra.
Thank you and good evening. As it has been told about me that I am a psychologist, and in psychology I do social psychology. First, I would like to thank Professor Gyan Prakash. After reading his book about this community, in fact, we started on this project. So his book was of great help for us at theoretical level and at other level also. In psychology, I would like to quote one author because quite often my basic interest is in theoretical aspect of psychology, but in psychology you will find a group of people who are very much interested in applied kind of work. So there is constant accusation against people like us that your work is of no value, it is only a theory, it is only in the air. So just to respond to this charge, I would like to quote very important psychologist Kurt Lewin, who said that there cannot be a better applied work than providing a sound theory. So for me, the distinction between theory and practical work or applied work gets blurred. And that justifies and gives me confidence to continue my interest in theoretical work in psychology. Why do I take theoretical interest in psychology? Because as a student of psychology who never got a chance to study in any international or foreign university, so I'm totally product of Indian University, at undergraduation from Patna University and then Delhi University. But as a student of psychology, whenever I got chance to attend seminar and some kind of workshop where people from other social science discipline would speak, I used to feel myself completely a dumb who was not able to understand most of the thing what other social scientists were talking. And then I started reflecting, is it because of my personal deficiency or is it because of the discipline which I have studied? And after some time with some brooding, I discovered that it is basically because of the discipline of psychology, which does not allow you to think about the broader context in which this discipline. Then I started taking interest in the theoretical aspect and critical aspect, why psychology, the way it developed. And I found that this kind of interest, anybody who keeps, is marginalized in my own discipline. So marginality is not only about a community. The experience of marginality is also associated with certain kind of interest, certain kind of urges. So if you want to become critical in certain kind of discipline, and my discipline is completely statist kind of discipline which associates itself with power structure and also legitimizes power structure and in return gets legitimized by power structure. So there was no scope for my kind of interest in psychology. Then I had to move away from psychology to find some kind of articulation, some kind of vocabulary, some kind of interest. Professor Gyan Prakash has talked about stereotype and stereotype through which people belonging to upper caste or people belonging to upper class or privileged section know this marginalized community and subaltern community. In psychology, we study about stereotype, but we study stereotype in very, very decontextualized manner. And there is hardly any kind of discussion around why there is emergence of stereotype and what kind of function or what kind of role does it play in society. But one of the recent theory which I read in psychology, which is called system justification theory, and it says about stereotype that it is part of ideology. And every society requires some kind of ideology. In fact, we know about Marx and Gramsci, who says that you have some function of ideology which tries to keep social order as a normal order. So stereotype is part of social order. And so why we associate certain kind of stereotypes with Musahar, answer is very, very obvious that privileged section of society wants this kind of stereotype, they do maintain and they also justify this kind of stereotype. So our work was an attempt to bust this kind of myth or stereotype that these stereotypes are not natural, because in psychology there is a tendency to naturalize things. In psychology we have a discourse around normality and abnormality, but if we do critical reading of discourse on normality and abnormality, because Foucault is hardly taught in mainstream psychology, so if you have to read Foucault, then you have to step out of your discipline. At least in Indian university system, Foucault is not taught, it is never discussed. You will not find even Foucault in the reading list of curriculum, even at PhD level. Because if you bring Foucault, then structure of psychological knowledge gets disturbed, which psychologists are quite afraid of. Similarly, I think every society requires some kind of order, a sense of normality, sense of also idealism. Who is ideal person? What is normal? If we start talking about Musahar community or any subaltern community, and we bring out to the fore that this is a construction, they have been pushed by certain kind of vested interest through some kind of generation of knowledge, then you create trouble for the people for whom the image of normality, the image of ideal society and ideal human being is very, very important. So investigation into the causes of marginalization is very, very uncomfortable exercise for the people who hold position of power in any society, including our society. Another interest that brought me to think about marginality and to work on marginality, because I have also interest in knowing that who is a healthy human being. Because as a student of psychology, you have to think about this question, that who is a healthy human being? What is the notion of mental health? Or who is a full human being? Or who is a fully functioning human being? I think our notion of healthy human being and fully functioning human being cannot be disconnected from the discourse through which you have been brought up. So this discipline of psychology draws upon the narratives and discourse of modernity. So in order to understand the real meaning of marginality, one has to also deal with the notion of or concept of modernity. So although in this book, not in very explicit sense, we try to deal with or to probe the notion of modernity, but in background it was there. And here I would like to recall René Descartes, who can be considered as one of the founding philosophers of modernity. And in his classic book, Discourse on Method, he introduced a new method in human history, and that was the method of exclusion. What did Descartes argue? That in order to capture truth, we have to discard many things. So it was very unique in human history that rather than talking about what we have to include, he was talking about what to exclude. And he pointed out what to be excluded in order to capture truth. So he said that you have to exclude history, you have to exclude culture, you have to exclude tradition. And not only you have to exclude tradition, you have to also exclude your body, awareness of your body, and you have to also exclude your emotion. So Cartesian mind or Cartesian self is only a cognitive self which is disembodied self. So modernity, or philosophical structure of modernity, rests on this Cartesian philosophy of this disembodied self, which is devoid of history, devoid of culture, devoid of tradition. Because if you bring all those things, then reality becomes very, very messy. And philosophical modernity find it very, very difficult to deal with that. Development discourse, which this book has tried to explicitly deal with, is part of the institution of modernity and discourse of modernity. This notion of development, one of the author I would like to quote, which is very, very popular, Andre Gunter Frank, who says that underdevelopment is creation of development. So development, on the one hand, pretends to obliterate or to remove underdevelopment, but model of development, or rather dominant model of development, implicitly, or maybe it's designed by default, creates a section of underdevelopment. And we can see that politics, that if there is no underdevelopment, there is no justification for any agency of development that deals with the development, or experts who talk about development, who talks about justification for the development. And we also know about the politics of development, why US president in 1945 for the first time brought this discourse of development and created this world into a binary of opposition, developed world and underdeveloped world. And with one statement, the diversity of this world, human society, was flattened out, which Professor Salil Mishra said in the beginning of that. So this discourse of modernity, basically, as Professor Salil Mishra also remarked, that flatten out the multidimensionality. Herbert Marcuse, one of the critical thinkers, has talked about one-dimensional man. So this discourse of development, discourse of modernity, through its discourse, tries to create an image of society and try to create an image of ideal human being who is one-dimensional or two-dimensional. So it reduces the multidimensionalness of human being to one-dimensional or two. So this book is an attempt to protest against this attempt of modernity to create human being in the mold of Western modernity. Here I would like to quote one of the important philosophers of science, Paul Feyerabend, who says that the apostle of science acted like determined conquerors. They materially suppressed the bearers of all alternative traditions. We also have read about Francis Bacon, who is one of the founder of modern science, and what he said about science, that we have to torture nature in order to get its secret. So please pay attention to the expression. We have to torture nature. So human being has to distance oneself from the nature. So human being is not part of nature. So in science, in very foundation and philosophy of science, there is inherent philosophy of otherization. So if you associate with yourself with the philosophy of science and with the knowledge that science creates, then by default, you have to create some kind of other category. And so if we think about society, we think about ideal society, then we have to think about some kind of other, and others are not ideal. One of the psychoanalysts, much after Freud, Julia Kristeva, she has talked about a concept of abjection, where she says that this is a psychological mechanism at individual level and at societal level also. Society also uses this mechanism of abjection. And what is this abjection? That we create a boundary, and we create a boundary of self and other, and who becomes other, that's some of the quality which might be part of you, which might be part of a society, but you are not able to comfortably deal with that aspect of society or aspect of yourself. So you project it to others. Freud talked about that, but Julia Kristeva clearly theorized it. I think Musahar, knowingly or unknowingly, not Musahar, but stereotype about Musahar that was created and maintained by upper caste and also endorsed by development agency, uses this mechanism, psychological mechanism of abjection, where Musahars are created as other, who do not have any kind of agency, who do not have any kind of voice. And now it is up to us to gift them some kind of, or we have to give them a gift of development, because they themselves are not capable of developing. This book made an attempt to also engage with Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak's famous Can Subaltern Speak? And our stand in this book was that, yes, they are able to speak, but they do not speak in the language of modernity. They speak in their own language. So if modern people or modernized self are not able to comprehend the voices of marginalized community, it is not deficit of marginalized community, rather it is deficit of the modernized self. And this book, I do not know how far we have been able to successful, but it was one of our agenda. Another agenda was that this book is not only about marginalized self. Our argument is that if you understand why there is a marginalization, one, that dominant section tries to create a marginalized community or marginalized section, but there are people who do not agree with you, and they want to maintain their distinctiveness, they want to maintain their diversity. Whereas the nature of modernity is that it is intolerant of any kind of diversity. It tries to homogenize the world, it tries to homogenize the discourse. So Muslim community, either knowingly or unknowingly, tries to cling to its tries to maintain its distinctive culture. It's a question mark on the core of modernity. It's a question mark on the lifestyle or life philosophy, which is based on the discourse of modernity. As again, I will come back to the issue of health. It's not that notion of health is important for an individual. Individual cannot maintain one's mental health if society is not very healthy. So I would like to bring the notion of healthy society. In discipline of psychology, nobody talks about healthy society. But my assumption is that, in fact, my hypothesis is that if society is not healthy, human being cannot remain healthy. So that's why all so-called developed society, and if you take example of America, US, so according to official report of American Psychiatric Association, that more than 70% American people need some kind of psychiatric help in order to deal with their day-to-day life problem. So this is one picture about a developed society. So how can we have a developed society? And through this book, we try to transmit this message to humanity and to other people, that a healthy society has to be an inclusive society. It has not to resort to the mechanism of otherization or mechanism of abjection. You have not to exclude anything. Rather, you should show magnanimity, and you have to be very tolerant towards diversity. And so I would like to recall here one of the important psychoanalyst, Erik Erikson, who made a distinction between two kinds of self, totalitarian self and holistic self. And he says that, what is totalitarian self? Totalitarian self creates an impermeable boundary around itself and clearly maintains a distinction between self and other. So other cannot be part of self, and then self remains always on guard to keep other at some kind of distance. And according to Erikson, A totalitarian self can never remain a healthy self. And he talks about holistic self. And holistic self, although it has some kind of boundary, but this boundary is very, very tentative and permeable boundary. And distinction between self and other is not so clear. And there is some kind two-way communication between self and other. And this boundary is like, if I use a metaphor of sea, if when we go seashore and we find that there is no boundary. So when wave comes, so at some point of time we see that there is beach and sea starts, but at other point of time sea wave comes and it obliterates that distinction and it keeps on shifting. So Erickson's argument was that a healthy self, which is holistic self, in holistic self has to remain with this kind of tentativeness. Ashish Nandi, whom we have dedicated this book, he also says that in traditional Indian society, there was never a sense of very definite notion of self. In traditional Indian society, human beings used to manage to live with some kind of tentative notion of self, where distinction between self and other was not very, very clear. By saying that, I do not want to say that traditional Indian society was free from all kinds of evil. We had some kind of problem, but at least we had one message, or we can get one message from traditional society, and that informs our theoretical framework for this book, that if we want to create our society as healthy society where individual can remain with mental health, then we have to all the time question the boundary that we have created around us, and through which we have created notion of normality and abnormality, through which we have created notion of development and underdevelopment, through which we have created notion of civilized and uncivilized, educated versus non-educated. I think this binary opposition itself is a product of or gift of modernity to humanity. And this book had tried to question, interrogate the discourse of modernity. I think I will end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mishra. That brings us to the end of the discussion. We've had 4 wonderful presentations. Arvind Mohan had to leave, so he could not make his presentation. Well, the presentations, much like the book, were focused on the theme at hand, the distinctiveness about the community, but also dealt with larger questions in terms of time and space, questions of marginality and development. Development, both as a process and as its legitimation, is not completely innocent of factors pertaining to caste and class. Those blinkers are almost built into it. They come there constitutively. They come along with the project of development. They cast their shadow. They foreclose certain possibilities. They create certain openings on the trajectory of development. And then various communities are then at the receiving end of it. And that then becomes the explanation for what Gyan Prakash called the implementation deficit. That creates marginality, but marginality and marginal groups, they are not, there are a whole range of options open before them. I think Manish Sinha talked about Sanskritization as one of the possibilities that must be there. But the other possibility which Gyan Prakash talked about was a very, very rebellious, revolutionary, transgressive one, through the Algerian example, that people, even very conservative practices like conservative and male dominational practices like the veil, they could turn out to be an extremely transgressive and revolutionary and subversive practices. So there is, at the level of creating an alternative trajectory, there are all kinds of possibilities that are open before us. So I think we've had a wonderful discussion. It's a wonderful book. It tells us so much about the community, and not much was known about it. And yet there are theoretical possibilities which have been dealt with, which have been explored, and they can be explored further. So the book will also create a space for more and more discussion along themes which interest all of us. Now, in the end, I would like to invite Mr. Nasif Muhammad Ali for a formal vote of thanks. So, Nasif Muhammad Ali, can I request you to please make a formal vote of thanks?
Sir, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes, you are, Nasif. Please.
Before delivering the vote of thanks, I would like to make an announcement that Primus Books has introduced a limited period discount on the book, The Marginalized Self, whereby it is now available for a 30% discount. The link to avail this offer has already been shared on the Facebook and Twitter pages of Deshkal Society. Now, moving on, distinguished moderator, speakers, and participants, I believe I'm speaking for everyone present here when I say that this has been a lively and enriching session. The times, as we all know, are such that human life and interactions are very much limited, and it is heartening in that sense to be part of a program and a collective that spans across the world. It is with this in mind that I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude on behalf of the Deshkal Society to Professor Salil Mishra, who moderated the session and ensured its smooth consolidation, our key speaker, Professor Gyan Prakash, and distinguished panelists, Professor Rajkumar, Mr. Manish Sinha, Mr. Arvind Mohan, and Dr. Arvind Kumar Mishra. Lastly, and most importantly, I would also like to thank all the participants for joining us in this event. We do hope to associate with you all in the future as well.